Hey everybody, I'm Jay Scherr with Jay Scherr Business Consulting. We help entrepreneurs, business owners, and other leaders maximize their potential, build rock-solid foundations for their businesses, and create more freedom in their lives. And you've joined Business Minds Coffee Chat. Carl Jung said, "All true things must change, and only that which changes remains true." Well, on today's episode, we talk about change and how to embrace it, disorder events, non-dual thinking, allostasis, rugged flexibility, identity, and more. My guest is a husband and father, a researcher, a USA Today and national best-selling author, and coach who focuses on health, well-being, and sustainable excellence. He's also the co-host of the Growth Equation podcast and is on faculty at the University of Michigan's Graduate School of Public Health. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Sports Illustrated, Forbes, and many other media outlets. Please welcome the man who's reminding us that even though we should expect it to be hard and that everything is changing, including us, we can learn to excel. Brad Stulberg. Brad, it is so great to see you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me, Jay. That's quite the intro. I hope I can live up to it.
Oh, I know you can. Well, I am super excited to dive into this conversation. So let's get started. I thought a good jumping off point would be for you to share with all of us what your favorite thing is about yourself and why.
I think that my favorite thing about myself, and this hasn't always been the case, but I do believe it is now, is my ability to take feelings, experiences, perhaps even deep knowings that people have, and to wrap some words around them, to provide some language for these things that we experience, we feel, as I said, maybe we even know, but we don't yet have the words for. And why? I think that words, they connect us. It's part of what sets our species apart, our ability to communicate. Language is how we derive meaning in our lives, and I think that it really helps me bridge the gap between the heart and the mind, right? The heart where the deep knowing and some of the emotion is, and then the mind or the intellect, which can come up with these words. And the words ultimately string together into sentences, and those sentences into paragraphs, and you pound the stone long enough, and if you're lucky, you have a book, and I've been lucky to have a few of them.
Absolutely. I love that response. And, share with us when you knew in your heart that you were going to be a writer.
Well, I didn't know in my heart that I was going to be a writer until, tomorrow. Like, I still don't know. Sometimes I have to pinch myself because it was always my dream to be a writer. All the way back to the middle school and high school newspapers. However, along the way, I got rejected multiple times. I got rejected from journalism school. So like any other high school kid, I assumed then that I guess I just won't be a writer. When I hit some lucky breaks in the early days of the blogosphere internet, I had so much writing rejected from paid publications. I said, I guess I just won't be a writer. My first book proposal was rejected by 36 publishing houses. I guess I just won't be a writer. Yet I always stuck with it, and here I am. So it's definitely been something that I've been curious about and I've gravitated toward since my very young adulthood. But I still have to pinch myself that I'm doing it professionally.
Beautiful. So with all of that said, Brad, I wanted to talk about change and disorder events. Because when I read your most recent book, Master of Change, one of the things that you talk about is the immense amount of change that you experienced over a 5-year period. And I want to explore that a little bit. So I'd love it if you would share with our audience maybe some highlights around what that 5-year period looked like for you, and then we can start to explore change itself.
That's right. Well, I moved across the country from Northern California, San Francisco, Oakland area, so big urban city, to the Blue Ridge Mountains in western North Carolina. I became a father for the first time. I had an injury that ultimately took me out of a sport that had been a significant outsized part of my identity for a very long period of time. My last book, The Practice of Groundedness, my first solo book, sold really well. It gave me the confidence to double down on writing. I became a father for the second time. I underwent a really painful family estrangement that I never would have imagined could happen growing up. So the good, the bad, the ugly, everything in between, a lot of change in a very compressed period of time. And this isn't to mention the change that we all went through, which is the coronavirus and the pandemic, which shifted how people work, how people play, how people gather, how people grieve. So that was overlaid on top of all of these other personal changes. And it felt like a lot. But when I would share this with other people, the most common response was, "Oh, I hear you. Like, me too. Let me tell you about all the changes that I've been through," or very similar ones, or perhaps they're different. But it really kind of set off this journey to understand why we think that change is a one-off event, when in reality we're always changing. Change is just the nature of our lives. The research shows that the average adult experiences over 35 major life changes. So when you hear that, it puts my last 5 years into perspective, and it's not really the exception, it's the rule.
So it sounds like you might have had a good percentage of that total number all within a compressed period of time. So how did you process through those changes that you experienced? Obviously, that becomes part of the impetus for writing this book, which we're blessed that you brought this book to life. We're going to talk more about that. But how did you work through those changes? What was your state of mind, and what were some of the things that you specifically were doing to manage through that level of change?
Right. I think there's before I dove into writing this book, and then there's after, and I became a lot more skillful after because I just learned so much in research and reporting. But before, there was a little bit of freaking out and feeling discombobulated by it all. Reaching out for help and support from a wonderful therapist, from friends, from family was very important to me. And then something that I did do well, even before diving into the research from the book, was sticking to the routines that I could have in my life that were immune from those changes. And for me, that is reading, writing, and exercise. And really having those be a source of predictability and an anchor in my days, in my weeks, in my months. After the research and reporting for this book, I got a lot better at navigating the change. There was a lot less discombobulation in freaking out, because I learned that this stuff wasn't happening to me. I was in conversation with all of it. And while there were times when my agency had limits, there were times when I actually could control significant portions of these events. And I could dictate them on my own terms, and there were times when I couldn't dictate them on my own terms. But it became less of these things happening to me and more of an ongoing conversation.
So you mentioned therapy. Can you give us an idea of what type of therapy you were experiencing and how that was beneficial for you?
Yeah, it's called acceptance and commitment therapy, and also cognitive behavioral therapy. I think the latter is more well known. It's received more coverage. The former, less so, but every bit as powerful. Any good therapist would say they're very close cousins. Acceptance and commitment therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, they're part of these third wave evidence-based therapies. So that's been a big part of my life. It's been a big part of my thinking. And if folks read the book, they'll see particularly the threads of acceptance and commitment really run through the entire book.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. And what did you learn specifically about yourself, Brad, as you were going through this process of change? If you can think about specific things that you recognized in yourself, things that you learned about yourself, what would you point to?
That's such a good question, Jay. And in the retrospect, I think that it's easy. When you're going through it, it's harder. I think I learned that I am too hard on myself at times, and sometimes that I expect that I should have everything figured out because, hey, I'm a coach, I write books on these topics, and that's a really heavy weight to carry and a heavy expectation, and no human ever has everything figured out. So I learned to practice self-compassion. So that's kind of the other side of this coin of being too hard on oneself, is then learning, how do you have your own back? How do you become your own best friend? That's one big lesson. And then the other big lesson that, again, when I was going through it, maybe not so much, but now definitely, is the value of just showing up and letting that be enough. So not needing to force or contrive meaning or optimism or positivity or gratitude or growth mindset or grit or any of these popular constructs when you're in the midst of a true challenge. Showing up and just getting through can be enough sometimes. And then once you get to the other side, suddenly you tend to have growth in meaning, in learning, in all of these more positive attributes. And I think that that's for really big, significant changes. I think for 98% of the changes that we face, being armed with tools like growth mindset will equip you and will go a long way. But there's also times in life when you just have to release from all that and just focus on getting through. And the meaning and growth, if they're going to occur, they occur on their own time, and they occur on the other side of these changes. In the framework that I use, they don't occur during the disorder, but they occur in reorder.
Interesting. So since you mentioned that, let's talk about homeostasis versus allostasis. So explain to our listeners what the difference is, and this becomes a big part of your book as well.
Homeostasis is hundreds of years old. It dates back to really the beginning of empirical science. And the term itself was coined nearly 170 years ago in the mid-1800s. And it describes change as a cycle of order or stability, then disorder, chaos, or change, and then back to order. So it's order, disorder, order. And homeostasis says that individuals and organizations, even entire communities and cultures, they crave stability, and therefore change is bad, because change is at odds with stability. And we ought to resist change, avoid change, and if we have no choice, try to get back to where we started as fast as possible. Those are the defining principles of homeostasis. And for the last few hundred years, homeostasis has been the guiding conventional wisdom around change in the West. However, more recently, in the past few decades, the research community stepped back and said, actually, when we evaluate and when we look at individuals and organizations that are really thriving, they don't follow that homeostatic approach to change at all. There's a nuanced difference, and it's very important, which is they go from order to disorder to reorder. So it's true that we crave stability, but that stability is always somewhere new. And we're always somewhere in this cycle of order, disorder, and reorder. And whereas homeostasis said that change is something to resist, allostasis says that there's no such thing. If you were to resist change, you'd be resisting life. And I think that the etymology of the two words really tells the whole story. So homeostasis comes from the Latin root homo, which means same, and stasis, which means standing. So it says that we achieve stability by staying the same. And allostasis comes from the Latin root allo, which means change or variable, and then stasis, which again means standing. So it says that we achieve stability through change. And it just has such an elegant, beautiful double meaning that the way to achieve stability through change is through change, at least to some extent.
I love that. I remember when I first was introduced to Buddhism, which goes back several years now, and I started to really delve into certain Buddhist practices and learning about suffering and the fact that if we're trying to grasp onto something, if we're trying to resist change, that only leads to suffering. And it began to make a tremendous amount of sense because I was one of those who really wanted to hold on to what was, who had a difficult time letting those things go and trying to control the things that I really have zero control over. So it speaks to this as well. Has that been an experience of yours too, where you've tried to resist change and that ultimately it led to suffering for you?
I mean, of course, I grew up in the West, so it's the water that we swim in. So absolutely, I was taught to hold on tight, to squeeze, and seize. And what's interesting is there's nothing wrong with holding on tight. I think that holding on tight to the things that you love and you care deeply about is part of what gives life meaning and texture. What I argue in this book is that if you're going to hold on tight, you also have to learn how to let go. And it's not either or, it's both and that can be really hard for people, especially those of us that were brought up in the West, where homeostasis was the prevailing model. And the notion of holding on tight and letting go, those are opposites. How could you possibly do both? But there's a whole other way of thinking, which is this non-dual way of thinking that says actually most of the complexities in life are not this or that, but this and that.
Yeah, incredible. So you, in Master of Change, you introduce us to the concept of rugged flexibility. And that really is a new model for working with change and thinking about identity over time. So the book really is broken down into three key parts, and you weave rugged flexibility into those three parts, and they are mindset, identity, and actions. I would love it if we could spend a couple of moments on some of the bigger key areas of each of those three sections. So let's start with mindset. And I'd love to introduce our audience to a few of the concepts underneath each of these areas. So under mindset, you start with being open to the flow of life. So explain that to us, and let's talk about a couple of the areas under that section.
Yeah, I think of being open to the flow of life as riding the waves instead of trying to push against them. Because the waves are going to come, or the weather patterns are going to come. They're going to create the waves. And if you try to push against a wave, you just get walloped by it. But if you can open to those waves, you give yourself a chance at riding them. And you don't have to like them all, but you can stay above water. So that's the beautiful metaphor. How do we actually do this? The first core concept is one that was coined by Erich Fromm, who's one of my intellectual heroes, the late Erich Fromm. He passed away a couple years ago, I guess more than a couple years ago now. But he was a mid-1900s psychoanalyst, humanist philosopher, brilliant writer and thinker. And he had this framework of having versus being. And to have a having orientation, we identify ourselves by the things that we have. So I have this car, I have this house, I have this business, I have this body, I have these kids, I have this partner, whatever it might be. And Fromm so elegantly argued that if we define ourselves by what we have, we're fragile because everything that we have is bound to change. And when those things change, well, we won't know who we are. Whereas if we define ourselves in what Fromm called a being orientation, or by our essential core qualities, by who we are, so not what we have, but by who we are, by our core values, those things can't be taken away from us. So that is really helpful, is a foundational mindset shift, to try to catch yourself saying, I have kids. No, I am a parent, or I'm in love with these kids. I have this car. No, like I get around in this vehicle. I have this house. No, I live in this house. And again, back to what I said in the opening, I think that language really does shape our reality in so many ways. And just switching out of this having mindset to more of a being mindset goes such a long way to make us more rugged and flexible in the midst of change, because we're not clinging on so tight. So that's one key tool.
Now, before we move any further, I just want to make the point that the book it's research and science based. So everything that you write about in this book, you have researched. There is a tremendous resource that comes along with the book as well, that you can get additional information. There's a PDF that comes with the book if you get the audio version of it. But I say that because in this particular example, we're talking about the power of language. These seem like very subtle shifts in words, but the impact is wide-ranging. And so, this is an area that I spend time studying myself, because it's so important, the words that we use to ourselves and the meaning that we attach to those. It can be so powerful. So let's continue on. So the next section underneath of part one, if you will, is expecting it to be hard. So give us an example from this section of the book.
All right. Well, our expectations are so important in shaping our mood and our response at any given point in time. Psychologists use this offhand equation that your happiness is a function of your reality minus your expectations. So if your expectations are out of alignment with your reality, you generally don't feel very good. The example that is quite extreme but makes this really clear is if you imagine that you're running a marathon and you expect mile 20 to be easy, well, then when you get to mile 20, you're going to freak out and quit because it's not easy at all. It's very hard. Whereas if you go into a marathon expecting mile 20 to be hard, then when you get there, you'll be prepared. And on a good day, you might even be pleasantly surprised. There's some fascinating research that shows our pain response is very much impacted by our expectations. So if we're in a situation where we expect that we might be injured versus we're randomly injured, we feel a lot more pain when we're randomly injured than when we expect it might happen. And you can observe this all the way at the hormonal level of cortisol, the stress hormone that's released. So the example that pain science researchers use, again, it's very extreme, but in the extremes you find these clear points, is if you imagine someone who is shot in the leg on the battlefield versus someone who is shot in the leg in a parking lot. The same person, same leg, same bullet, the person in the parking lot experiences a lot more pain and has a much higher biological stress response than the person on the battlefield because of expectancy, because the person on the battlefield, it's within the realm of expectations that could happen. So how do we apply this to our own lives? Well, in many ways, change is simply our expectations going awry. We think things are going to go in the direction of A, but they go in the direction of A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And the quicker we are able to update our expectations to match reality, the more able we are to deal with reality, to meet reality. The longer that we cling and we hold on to our expectations and we don't update them, the more that we suffer.
So if our expectations are such that it can hold us back from actually doing something, from taking that next step, that can obviously become problematic. So when you talk about updating our expectations, how can we find that balance between making sure we understand what realistic expectations are, yet also ensure that they are set in such a way that will still take that next step, that necessary action?
Ooh, it's a good question, and I like it. And I also sense a little bit of, well, are you saying that we should set low expectations? And I don't necessarily think that's right. I think that we should have high expectations of ourselves and of things that we have internal control over. But things that are outside of our control, I mean, the most Buddhist way to do it would be to release from expectations altogether. It's just what's happening is happening. And the more that we can be with that and see it clearly for what it is, the more we're able to respond. So in the moment, what can really be helpful for me is just to ask myself, has this situation changed? And if so, am I holding on to old expectations of what I thought it would be? And if the answer is yes, then that's a cue to do the hard work of seeing reality for what it is and letting those old expectations go. In a business setting, you thought your plan was going to go X, Y, Z, and then there's a change in the external environment, or there's some internal changes in the organization, whatever it is, and you're halfway through the quarter, and you get the report, and it's not what you thought it would be. Well, are you able to say, those were my expectations, this is reality, I need to live in reality, not my expectations. How can I address reality as best as possible with the tools that I have?
Perfect. That's a great example. Thank you for sharing that. So let's move to the second area of the book, which is under identity. And this is one that I personally have struggled with for years. And you brought something up toward the beginning of the conversation that I want to tug on a little bit. And that was around an injury that you experienced that held you back from a sport that you had identified yourself with. Or that's one of the ways that you identified your humanity and your own being.
Yeah, I was a runner until I wasn't.
Until you weren't. So walk us through this part of the book, because I think this is incredibly important. And you talk about cultivating a fluid sense of self. And you do such a great job of articulating this in the book, and it was very meaningful for me. And I know it's going to be for our audience as well. But let's walk through that, because this applies specifically to what you experienced in your life. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to tell the story of someone that's a much better athlete than me to drive home this point. His name is Niels van der Poel, and he won the gold medal in the 2022 Winter Olympics in both the 5K and the 10K long course speed skating events. And he also shattered the world record. So he is the best speed skater to ever step foot on this planet. In the lead up to those games, though, van der Poel felt he was underperforming, and he asked himself why. And he identified fear. He was carrying a lot of fear every time he stepped in to compete. And then he said, well, why do I have all this fear? And the reason for all this fear is that he realized there was no Niels van der Poel outside of Niels van der Poel, the speed skater. There was complete fusion. And he realized that that made him really fragile, because he could get injured, he could get ill, he could have one misstep once every 4 years in the Olympics, and that's everything. And there was nothing else to him. So his entire identity was wrapped up in this one thing. And this one thing inherently was going to change. Even if he had a flawless career, eventually he would age out of peak performance. So van der Poel did something that at the time is very much unheard of for an Olympian, which is he took a normal weekend. So starting Friday night to Monday morning, van der Poel did nothing related to the sport of speed skating. He went out for pizza and beers, he went bowling, he went hiking, he started reading books, he got involved in the community, and he developed these other facets of meaning in his life, these other sources of identity. And what that allowed him to do was shed his fear, because now he realized that even if something went wrong in the speed skating ring, there was a strong Niels van der Poel beyond the sport. And that allowed him to show up and play from a place of joy and love and competing to win, instead of competing from a place of fear and compulsion and competing not to lose. And I think that it is just so important for all of us to think about diversifying our identities so that we have multiple components to ourselves, so that when we experience change in one of those areas, we can lean onto the others for stability. The metaphor that I've come to use is of a house. So if you've got a house and it just has one room in it, and that one room catches fire, you're in big trouble. But if you have a house with a couple rooms and one room catches fire, you can go spend time in the other rooms while you put the fire out in the room that is on fire. And I think our identities are very much the same way. If we can have multiple rooms in our identity, it allows us to be so much more rugged and flexible when there's a big change in one of those areas. And I also love this metaphor because not all the rooms have to be the same sizes. Some rooms can be bigger than others. That's okay. You can spend a lot more time in some rooms than others. That's okay too. It's just about having more than one room. And you can also do a remodel. You can add rooms to your house. You can take rooms away. All this is fair play. You just never want to be in that one room only, because if something bad happens, negative change, it makes you so fragile.
Yeah, that's a great analogy and a good visual for all of us. And I think about the number of people that come out of the military as an example who, whether it's, their career has come to an end, they are switching to another role, and they have not created that fluidity, if you will, with their identity, and that is how they've attached everything to that title, to that role, to that person who they've been for so many years. You see it with NFL players as well. And it's sad when you see someone who has gone through that change and they don't have the tools to be able to work through that. And unfortunately, many of them go down a very bad path as a result. So
that's right.
So thank you for sharing that. So also in this section of the book, you talk about developing rugged and flexible boundaries. So let's talk about the topic of boundaries for a moment. So give us an example of what you mean by rugged and flexible boundaries.
Yeah, so these are boundaries, not in the more common way that they're talked about in terms of who you're going to have time for and what you're going to prioritize. These are boundaries for yourself. So if you think about identity like a river and it's always flowing, well, a river is guided by its bank. And without a bank, there is no river. It's just random water. And if we have a fluid identity that is evolving and changing, well, we need something to direct that evolution. And these are the rugged and flexible boundaries of our identities. And a religious person might call this a soul. Someone that is approaching it from a psychology perspective would probably call this our core values. And I put myself somewhere in between. I use them interchangeably. I think core values are more concrete, so let's talk about those. Our core values are the qualities that we aspire towards, that when we are feeling and doing our best, we're acting on. They're the things that we hold most dear. So they can be things like creativity, wisdom, intellect, health, family, love, compassion, kindness, community, whatever they may be. And these core values, they help us walk into uncertainty and navigate change. Because even when everything around us is changing, we can always ask ourselves, well, what are my 3 to 5 core values? Or what are my 1 to 5 core values? And what would they have me do? What would the kind thing to do be in this situation? What would the creative thing to do? What would someone who values health do? What would someone who values wisdom do in this situation? And those core values, they really provide a compass for us as we navigate our life's paths.
Perfect. And in the book, you provide an entire list of core values for the reader to be able to review, and might be some core values there that resonate with you as the reader. So excellent. Thank you for explaining that. So let's go to the third big section of the book, which is really around actions. And here you first talk about, and I love this section, respond, not react. And you talk about the 4 Ps in this section. So let's talk about the importance of responding versus reacting?
Well, when there's an unexpected change, we can either react to it, which is hot, emotional, instinctive, or we can respond, which is more thoughtful, more deliberate, more discerning. And generally speaking, we regret when we react. This is when we snap. No one likes to snap. And we sleep well at night when we respond, when we're thoughtful, when we bring our most evolved, wise sense of self to the situation. So most people intellectually get that. It's got a nice ring to it, respond, not react. But the question is, how do you actually do this? And I've developed a framework because every book like this needs a framework. And it's real simple. It's the 2 Ps versus the 4 Ps. So when we react, we follow the road of the 2 Ps. We panic and we pummel ahead. No one wants to do that. When we respond, we pause, we gather ourselves, we take a few breaths, we process, we name our emotion to create some space between us and it. We make a plan. We say, all right, given what's happening, what are our skills, capabilities, and resources? What can we control versus what can't we? And only then do we proceed. And what I love about this is 4 Ps inherently, as I talk through it, it stretches things out. It creates that space between stimulus and response. And as so many great philosophers have said, it's in that space between stimulus and response that our freedom lies.
Absolutely. And Viktor Frankl speaks about this in Man's Search for Meaning, which I happen to have right over here. Excellent book. And I tell you, Brad, one of the tools that has helped me out tremendously in this particular area, just to create a bit more space there, is meditation. And it's something that, I encourage everyone to at least try and understand, for those that are watching and listening right now, that it is a practice, right? So it's something
right.
that we do, and whether you do it for 30 seconds to begin with, up to 20 minutes or longer, just doing it really started to help me understand how to pay attention to my thoughts, but not get lost in the thoughts. And then over time, and I've been meditating for 5-6 years, over time, I was able to at least create just enough space there to engage the logic part of my brain, my prefrontal cortex, so I could start to ask questions and not get pulled into that emotional reaction, if you will. I don't know if I'm explaining that properly, but that's the way that I view it. Do you meditate also as a practice?
I think you're explaining that really well. I'd say that there are 3 practices to help us respond, not react. So the first is meditation, for all the reasons that you just elegantly described. When you sit to meditate, you realize that all sorts of thoughts, feelings, and urges come to take you away from your breath. And the whole work is not to react to them, to create some space, to realize that thoughts, feelings, and urges come and go, and you don't have to fuse with them. You can see them, and then you can choose. Do I want to tug on this, or do I want to let it go? And the practice of meditation is a constant letting go and coming back to the breath. So I view that as like training in the gym. That's how you strengthen the muscle. Then when you're actually on the playing field, when you're in the moment and an unexpected change or uncertainty happens, labeling your emotions is really powerful. Psychologists call this affect labeling. And it simply asks you that when you feel yourself getting frustrated or angry or excited or sad or despairing or overwhelmed, you simply name what you're feeling. And you can even say, I'm feeling anger in my chest, or I'm feeling frustration in my neck. I'm feeling emptiness in my stomach. I'm feeling excitement throughout my veins in my body. And simply by naming what you're feeling, you create some space between you and it. So you shift from being completely fused with that emotion, which is very reactionary, to being the observer of that emotion, which then puts you in a stance to respond. So meditation, strengthen the muscle in the gym. Affect labeling, name your emotion in real time. And then the third practice, and maybe the most important, but the least talked about, is to try to put yourself in responsive environments, not reactive environments. So if you spend all day on political Twitter and watching cable news and with very reactionary people, it will be very hard for you to respond, not react, because you'll be primed to react. Whereas if you choose to read books, listen to conversations, Single task. Right now, we are having such a responsive conversation because we're not reacting to multiple stimuli. We're really here. That makes you a more responsive person. So there's the meditation component, there's the affect labeling, and then there is the, well, what water do you want to swim in? And if you swim in a reactive water and you want to be a responsive person, it will be much harder than if you try to expose yourself to more responsive environments and more responsive activities.
Wow, such great tools. I love this. And then last but not least, and we'll just very briefly talk about making meaning and moving forward. And by the way, for all of you that are watching and listening, we're going to provide a link to purchase this book. I would highly encourage you to do so and apply the tools that you learn. At the very last part of the book, Brad provides 5 questions as well as 10 tools for embracing change and developing rugged flexibility. So pay attention to that. But let's talk very briefly about making meaning and moving forward. This is so incredibly important.
Yeah, it's just that when we go through cycles of order, disorder, and reorder, generally speaking, we make meaning and we grow and we move forward. But as I mentioned at the outset, in my own experience, and the research shows that this is just about everyone's experience, for really big changes, you can't force that process. The meaning and growth, if they're going to happen, they come on their own time. And I think this is an area where driven type A pushers, business professionals, optimists, perfectionists get into real trouble. Because when you go through a change, be it good or bad, divorce, marriage, having kids, kids leaving the house, starting a business, losing a business, whatever it is, you say, all right, well, I have to grow from this. What would it look like to grow from this challenge? And sometimes it takes months to grow and to learn from a challenge. And particularly for negative ones, when you're really in the thick of something, it's adding an extra weight to have to try to grow from it in the moment. And what the research shows really clearly is that following big changes, meaning and growth, if they're going to happen, they tend to happen at least 3 months out from the change. And the more that you try to force that process, the longer it takes. So this is when you're in the midst of the storm, your job is to put up your umbrella and seek shelter and refuge and just get through the storm. And then when the weather passes, you can look back, and that's when you grow and make meaning. But you don't want to chase your own tail by trying to force it during the process. Because what ends up happening is you can take a negative, which is a crappy experience or something really hard that's happened in your life, and then turn it into a double negative, which is not only what you're going through, but the judgment that I can't even do what the self-help books say. You know, how come I can't think of 3 things I'm grateful for right now? How come I'm not finding all this meaning in this that's happening? And the answer is because you're still in the thick of it. So let go from that, get through, and then on the other side, that's where there is meaning.
That is so good. So well stated. So, Brad, as we are wrapping up our conversation today, I would love it if you would share a challenge with all of us. What would you challenge our audience and me to do?
So we went through a lot in this conversation, and I think that for any of these practices to be cemented, we have to practice them. You know, you'll notice I don't use the word habits too often. I don't use shifts. I use practice because a practice is something that you care about, that you pay attention to, and you get on the path, you fall off the path, you get back on, you fall off again, you get back on, and that's a practice. And I think that for these concepts, pick 1 or 2, and then try to come up with some concrete ways that you'll practice it. So how will you practice diversifying your identity? How will you practice updating your expectations to match reality? How will you practice responding, not reacting? How will you practice trying to operate more from a place of being than having? And I would just pick literally 1 is enough, 1 is plenty, and start there, and then go from there and build. And then, as you mentioned, I think if individuals found this useful and they want to go deeper, the book has a whole repertoire of other concepts and even these concepts in more detail to wrestle with and then to apply to your own life.
Fantastic. Again, all of you, please make sure you do go out and purchase a copy of Master of Change. It is an exceptional book. There are so many tools in this one. It's a deep book, but it's also very applicable. and very practical. So we'll provide a link to that. Brad, I want to thank you so very much for joining us today on Business Minds Coffee Chat. I appreciate you not only being here, but I appreciate you sharing a bit about your story, bringing Master of Change to life, and sharing with all of us some of the tools that, if we apply them, can actually help transform and change our lives. So thank you. I'm grateful for you.
Thank you so much for having me, Jay. I appreciate you.